So I've really enjoyed that 30 years in the innovation world, and you have to realize that Procter and Gamble has about 8,000 scientists, and to move them into an open innovation mindset, that was quite a journey that I was fortunate to see from the inside and up close. And then in the last part of my career, actually leading that effort. As Jan said, I'm currently having great fun helping others succeed in innovation thinking. And as part of the classes I give at Solvay Business School, we also do free field projects with groups of 4 students to dive into innovation for 2 or 3 months. So do reach out also if you think that you might have a project that would be suitable for a group of students. I've received a little questions from you ahead of time. Questions that you raised as you signed up with the sessions. And for me, the questions basically highlight 2 things. Like, one is how broad the area of innovation is and how we all have a slightly definition of it. So I will take a few steps of defining some terminology, some frameworks early on so that we speak a similar language. And then, yes, there is a lot of uncertainty already around innovation, and the corona crisis is clearly making it even more severe as we speak. So I think I will cover about half of the questions that you raised up front in the story that I will tell, but I'll reach out to you with the slides so that everybody has it. And if I see questions that I haven't been answered, I'll try to answer them in the email, and happy to engage further discussion along the way, because I'm sure that I can learn a lot from you as well, from your experiences. Basically, the flow for this evening is I'm going to start from, why innovation skills are so important, why innovation management is something that everybody needs to get. Then stressing the unique point in time that we are, where a lot of businesses, the challenge isn't inventing new technology, but more around how do we bring that into a business model that works, because it has already been invented. Then we're going to dive into terminology, and then I'll take a deeper dive into the open innovation in P&G, the history, how did it came about, and then we're going to look at some core lessons that came out and that potentially might be helpful for some folks on the call. And then I'm also going to take a next step around, why this is no longer enough, the one-on-one open innovation as we've seen, and have some suggestions on how you get started beyond that. But as this first slide indicates, the World Economic Forum came basically to the same conclusion, that this is no longer just for innovation managers. This is something that all senior managers, whether you're CFOs or CEOs, need to get involved in. And the definition that I use here for innovation is basically conversion of novelty into value. Now, novelty, therefore, doesn't need to be a new technology. It might be as simple as your HR department learning some techniques from Coca-Cola HR, some skills that are new for that organization and that makes your organization or your people more productive. So it's really that conversion of novelty for you into value for you. So with that definition, you can easily see how innovation has become a key for survival in these dynamic times along the way. Then as we move forward on a slide, novelty is, how do you think ahead, right? And our brains, unfortunately, tend to think linear and tend to think in a straight line. But we live in a period of exponential times. We've seen that obviously with the coronavirus. You see if 3 people infect 3 others and they infect 3 others, how quickly that slide goes up. But it's also happening in the technology front. So let me just give you some examples along the way. If you think about DNA sequencing, the very first genome was done in 1999, and it cost $2.7 billion to get that done. By 2014, you could get your genome done below $1,000. Today, you can do it well below 100, and the expectation is that in the next 2-3 years, we're going to hit actually below $1. So, getting your DNA decrypted is going to be something that is very much along the way of what doctors will anticipate. You can go to the next slide, Dion, the one with the, yes, that's the curve. That's just showing the changes. If you think about LiDAR, the equipment that you need to make self-driving cars, right? In 2012, that would cost about $75,000 on a car. Now, it costs around 50. If you think about 5 years out, the technology that we use is going to be 30 times better than it is today. We're going to be in 5 or 10 years, we're going to be asking ourselves, do we even want humans still to drive, given the safety that we have relative to very much improved self-driving cars. If you think about IoT, for less than 75 cents, I can connect my coffee machine to the internet. Is that helpful? I don't know, but for 75 cents that I can wake up and I can just make the coffee while I'm still needing to get down, or that same signal can be sent to a supermarket that knows that how often I use on my coffee machine and therefore when they need to send me new coffee for 75 cents, it's going to happen, right? And then last one that I've seen very close is solar power, where solar power used to cost around $80 per kilowatt hour in 1977 when we got started. Currently, per kilowatt hour, the latest startup that is fields that are starting up in the Middle East are now doing less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So solar energy is going to be virtually free. And what I'm trying to do with these stories is show you how quickly the world is changing. And while most of us drive forward using the rear view mirrors to look at what happened behind us to predict the future, we now need to start looking around corners because the speed of change is that amazing. And that is even more so if you think about platforms, right? The platforms that are out there today is that you can digitalize anything. There are sensors, scanners, clicks, anything becomes input. Everything can be connected, so you can get these input from virtually all devices, and then all you need to do is get that data together, either in the cloud or on the edge, process it, whether that's artificial intelligence or self-learning or what have you, and then you can use the output, the signal, sending it back to robots, or you can even materialize it again with 3D printing. So it is an incredible world of change. And the message that I think is happening to us right now, but the challenge isn't so much to invent. The challenge is much more around how do we use everything that is possible today and turn it into a superior business model. And that is a very different type of innovation than what we used to do before, or at least the terminology that we used before. So if we go to the next slide, I quickly want to lay out the 3 levels or 3 different types of innovation that I think exist, and they tend to be very different between them. The first one is all about increasing productivity, right? And I think that is everybody's job. Learning from best practices, constantly benchmarking how you do things, at times using some external brains in the shape of consultants can help because they look into many different kitchens. And some companies haven't yet gotten the culture right of this constantly looking for ways to do things better and to embrace suggestions independent of where the idea comes from. And that might require some level of skill development, as I've seen in my later years. The second duck is around incremental innovation, right? Incremental innovation is often done by a developmental group. So think about Peugeot bringing out the 305, then a 306, then a 307, then a 308. And you know, what can you do in that type of space? Sometimes it's about products, sometimes it's about selling. I myself was involved in China at one moment with getting people converting from cotton diapers into paper diapers, right? And we put 100 cameras at cribs for babies that were using cotton diapers and 100 at babies that were using Pampers. And what we see was that the babies who were using Pampers were sleeping significantly better. And it doesn't take rocket science to figure out that well-rested babies tend to be happier babies. So the selling line was very much like, hey, if you want to have a happy baby, use Pampers. That moved on to, we also did some work with UNICEF, and they have quite a bit of data on brain development of children, and a good night rest is incredibly important for brain development. So, hey, if you want a smart baby, use Pampers, very different type of campaign. And then obviously every time when the baby cries, there's also a mom showing up in the camera. So there's a third campaign that we then did and say, hey, moms, if you want to sleep, use Pampers. So it was basically 3 different selling lines, but basically not touching the product at all along the way. The third bucket is the disruptive innovation, and I've linked that here with business model innovation, because this is where I think it is no longer just an R&D group that needs to be involved. So disruptive innovation often includes an element of value destruction. I mentioned that we were running Belgacom, the Belgian national phone company, 30 years back, and we make lots of money from international calls. And then a pitch comes in from a company called Skype, who says, you know what, we're going to make this available for free, and we're going to give camera on top, right? You can see why a lot of these companies missed the boat, because it was a lot of value destruction that happened along the way. If I take it a little closer to some of the projects I've worked on, it used to be that, hey, the one who makes the cleanest detergent gets most of the purchases in the supermarkets. But now you have the new washing machines that dose automatically. So you dump in 10 liters of a liquid, and the machine doses the amount of detergent that it thinks is appropriate. So while you were used to a process where you were up and close with Ariel maybe once a day or at least multiple times per week by pouring it in a machine, now something goes automatically in the back of the machine. That 10 liters is so big, your machine will start talking to the internet and just basically says, hey, bring the product to my front door. I don't enjoy going to shop for detergent. So the branding then starts going in, the distribution is done very differently. So your group of 100 engineers that makes the detergent better and better might not be relevant in a world where the business model is changing to which are the detergents that the machine will order and how do they get delivered, where probably the margin that the distributor is making is going to be way more important than the cleaning power that you move along. So you do need a limited but very focused part of your company to look at disruptive management. And this is the engagement where it's no longer about classic management, because the classic management rules of stability and the assumption that you can measure clear results don't apply. This is the world of lean management, where you want to engage with curiosity, you want to have 90-day plans, you want to have a different culture, and I've called these speedboats versus tankers. The bigger companies tend to be the tankers. They're relatively slow to move, and the last thing that you want to do is be on a tanker and start behaving as if you're a speedboat. That doesn't make any sense. The speedboats are the ones that are incredibly agile. They're willing to go everywhere and explore, and they might get you to places that are very interesting that you as a big company might want to get to. But you want to do that with either small groups internally that are kind of loose from the mothership, or you can do it externally. 9.5 is one of those venture capitals that I'm involved in that I mentioned here, that, for example, with TaylorNet, they wanted to explore a space that they weren't too sure about, and we created a company for them that is completely out, and 9.5 also brought their own money. So as a venture capital fund, we are running that company now for TaylorNet in a joint venture situation. It also can drive an ecosystem of engagement. If your employees sit at their own desk and do not interact much with the outside world, then that might not be the way that you get the disruptive ideas. So Work Hero is another client of mine that I work with that basically has a model that allows employees from various companies to mix by having co-working spaces, but in companies rather than externally, where those kind of cross interactions can take place. Let's go to the next one, Eon. When I then dive in with that background onto P&G, P&G didn't call it open innovation. We called it Connect and Develop. The website that you see up there, connectanddevelop.com, is still active. And if you have ideas on how to get in touch with Procter & Gamble, they still recommend you go through that page. And I've seen the back office of that page for quite a few years. Basically, this story started with this whole .com explosion. Between 1995 and 2000, the Nasdaq Composite Index rose by about 400%. So all the investors were heavily into these growing stocks, and therefore a company that just made shampoo and detergents and toothpaste wasn't making the margins that and the growth that investors wanted to get. So the company didn't have much of a choice but trying to become way more aggressive in their goals. And as you can imagine, ultimately that didn't work. So we went into 2000 missing 2 quarters, and Procter & Gamble literally lost half its value. And that was obviously an incredible crisis. And this is the point that was use of a crisis in a very positive way. And I guess that's part of my message is never waste a good crisis, because in a crisis, the brain is willing to accept changes that will never be seen acceptable before. So if you think about Procter in the 2000s, it was a very closed company. It had a promotion from within system, so only people right out of university would flow in, and then it was up or out. So there wasn't the fresh flow of other ideas into it. The nickname was the Kremlin on the Ohio River, where nothing got out. It was really a closed organization. And they had enough R&D resources that they basically could do just about everything inside. So in 2001, this open innovation called Connect and Develop started with a clear goal that to accelerate innovation development, and secondly, to increase the rate of success of innovation. The leadership very much was behind it and predicted faster, more sustaining solutions via collaboration, not in isolation. Basically, the assumption there's a lot more smart people that don't work for you than that you can ever afford, right? And then the role change was around how do you find the innovation, not necessarily develop the innovation, which was quite a different way, and hence the connect and develop rather than research and development. And it changed every core relationship with suppliers. The biggest suppliers to P&G, we would have conversation with and say, look, we take a business from you of so many millions of dollars. What are you doing with that money in terms of development? Can you use some of that development specifically in the areas where Procter & Gamble has interest, so that we got much more innovation coming out of the suppliers as well? So it was a deep and systematic company-wide program to bring the outside in, but also take some of the inside out. It turned out we had some technologies and patents that other people were interested in. We also started licensing those out with good revenue results. So then if you look at 2005, around half of the innovation was already fueled by external partnerships. So this change was incredibly fast. The Connect and Develop contributions were heading towards the 3 billion in sales growth. And we set a goal also for becoming the partner of choice, so that if somebody wanted to develop something, they wanted to come to Procter because it had very much a win-and-win leadership mindset. And yes, by 2010, all those goals were delivered, and we moved on to bigger and better goals along the way. As we move to the next slide, Ion, maybe before I dive into saying exactly what we learned, let me tell you some stories around how open innovation is really strategic work first, being very clear on what you want. And I'll give you 4 examples of things that I've been involved in. If you have a core area like the pots, the little things you now throw in your dishwasher or your washing machine, P&G is deciding that that's very much core. That's an area that they want to be, particularly in the film understanding and the interaction between the juice and the film and the speed of making these pods, they want to be best in the world at. And if you want to be best in the world, you're going to be looking for, you know, who are the best partners in this space? Who are the best academic partners? And really build long-term relationships where you integrate these partners as much as possible into the program. And you work IP very much on a multi-company element, so that your open innovation is open in the sense that multi-companies work together, but it still is very much sealed off from the outside world. The second example that I would give is still core, but not exclusive. Pringles, the chips. At one moment, we wanted to look at whether we put smiley faces on those Pringles or little jokes. So we wanted to be able to print on the Pringles. Now, it needed to therefore be safe. It needs to be an FDA-approved ink. It needs to be able to spray on the chip at a high temperature. So still rather complex. And this would easily have taken 3-4 years of research to do that. And instead of it, we went outside and we started looking hard until we found an Italian cake company that was basically printing on cakes, and it turns out they had done a project with the local university. We looked at that IP, and we basically used most of that IP to then be able to deliver that on Pringles in say 4 months, what normally would have taken us years to do in-house. A third, but very different area, again, would be if you think about Febreze or Ambipur. They have great odor delivery techniques, and there's a lot of investment going into the perfumes and making them safe and consumer preferred, but also the delivery techniques. And whilst all this work was going on, there was an explosion taking place in the US around people going back to candles and wanting scented candles. And then the question was, okay, do we now want to go back and become experts in candle making? And the answer was no, that's not where our expertise wants to be. But yet there was a lot of demand of saying, hey, we would like to have Febreze or Ambipur candles because we think that they will sell very well. So then we looked for a strategic partner that could do that for us, using some of our technology in their candles. And it wasn't just contract manufacturing. We wanted these candle makers to also then develop different scents with us and co-develop the initiative pipeline on candles without Procter and Gamble being in the driver's seat. So a very different type of relation. And the last one that I would give as an example is the work that Kao, a great company in Japan, they had developed something like a Swiffer, where you go over the floor and it's electric static and it can clean up very quickly, particularly hard floors. And we had seen that product and we thought it was really a great product, but Kao had no plan of launching this product anywhere outside Japan, which happens in certain cases that, you know, certain countries tend to be a bit more internally focused. So we then, in Japan, this is a competitor of us, and we made a deal with them where we would then license their technology and basically launch it everywhere around the world using their core technology, right? So I just wanted to give you those 4 stories as an illustration of where open innovation can take you, and that it is a very important leadership role up front of figuring out what do you want. Now, what have I learned in this space for open innovation to work? The first one, as I think I've illustrated, is that it's a highly strategic set of work, right? You need to be really clear on what strategically you want to accomplish. Do you want to be best in the world at something, or is this just I want to play me too? And then problem definition. Highly strategic and complex senior leadership work. What are the needs? What are we looking for? And you might think that a lot of this work is more around what I would call shopping. And that's why I've crossed out ready to go. It hardly ever happens that you come across right what you need, right in front of you with a certain level of exclusivity. So open innovation in big companies, people think you just go to a few fairs and you pick up what you want. It really doesn't work that way. So it is not about shopping. It is much more about gardening. It's about finding out people that you want to get into a long-term relation with, and you grow together something that you know you'll need in the future, rather than just going out there and acquiring it. The third area there is win-win, right? Even more in these times of social media, you want to have an image that people can come to you and work with you on ideas that they have. And you can only do that if you do that win-win mindset. So I've had many conversations with startups or creative people. And my first question was always, do you have a patent? Do you have IP? And if the answer is no, then please don't tell me. I don't want to hear ideas that you have if they've not been patented, because of two reasons. Number one, there's a fair chance that P&G with 8,000 scientists is already working something that you come up as an idea with, and then you think I've stolen it from you, which is not what I want. And two, if you come with a great idea, I want this to be a win for you. So I want us to be able to document very clearly, what did you bring in? So what kind of patent do you have? And once patents do exist, I would offer up and say, okay, let me read the patents, and let me also ask a few IP lawyers to look at it, how you could beef it up, how you could make your patents stronger. Because if you and I are going to start working together, we don't want other competition to then come in and undercut your patent if it's not strong enough. So it was very much a relation of, okay, this only is going to move ahead if there's a win for both parties involved. It needs to be embraced down and up. Obviously, the leadership plays an incredible big role for saying, guys, we want you to reach out to the world and bring in better ideas. But it also needs to be embraced from the bottom up. If the people at the bottom feel like, oh, they're going to replace part of my research organization by external people, then they're gonna try to prevent that from happening. So on both ends, there need to be a consistent message that there is more than enough work for all of us. We just want to get out there faster, and we want to do that in the most effective way, which happened to be much more open. And then last but not least, you cannot use open innovation to have a project internally and then put up a group externally to do the same and just kind of let them compete against each other, how to come with a better idea. Whenever I've seen that set up, it is very simple. The internal group always wins. They know who to talk to, they know the system, they know the format of the PowerPoint. It's not a good use of the resources that you invest, leave alone the external resources. So in this principle of win-win, I would never set up an external project that is competing with an internal project along the way. All right, Dion, if we move on to the next sheet. So if you think about open innovation, open innovation typically has been around one-on-one relationship, and it has typically been in a way that the challenges are very company focused. And if you look at what stakeholders want today, they throw in very different things at us, right? Global warming, circular economy, water scarcity, all those elements are out there, and not one company can make a dent in those. Not even 2 or 3 big players. You need much more cooperation in the world to take on these type of challenges. The COVID-19 is just going to accelerate a lot of these elements, right? Are people really going to go back and commute every day? I don't think so, right? So this concept of work hero that I talked about might be a great idea, because we've experienced a different world. Supply chains are China now has become politically incredibly sensitive. There's lots of drive to buy fresh products from your local markets, from your local farmers. 3D printing is now also allowing for more local customization, right? Sarah, as you might know, has built a great model on this very different paradigm of agile supply chains that keep on changing very close to the market. The COVID-19 is also going to put more small players at risk, right? The companies that come through this, the biggest ones will hopefully have the biggest pockets, but a lot of small companies are at risk. So they might want to join more of a consortium of players to make sure that they just focus on what they do best rather than trying to do everything. And in general, we all want a better return on our innovation along the way. So I think we're heading to a model where an ecosystem needs to be anchored by a very big company. And then around that, you can have small, medium enterprises, startups, scale-ups, freelancers, associations, you name it, right? And to win within that consortium, everybody, better focus on what they do best. And speed is of the essence. So there's got to be a level of trust and simple agreements where lawyers are there to serve what you want to do in the ecosystem rather than the lawyers defining the rules before you get started, because then it's going to be another 20 years before you really get going. Let's move on, Ian. Right, so a little joke. I hope there's lots of laughter, but since you're on mute, obviously I have no idea. But there is a lot of strength in this, right? I mean, in reality, there is this COVID-19 is creating things that were not possible before. I know Brussels has been talking for years about solving the noise problem from Zaventem. And guess what fixed it? A very small virus right now is making sure it doesn't happen. Global warming is obviously a huge challenge, and there were weekly marches from students last year, and Greta Thunberg could not have asked anything more than what this virus has accomplished. So we are at an historic time to drive this change ahead along the way. So if we move one slide on, this is what I think is the future. You want to look for consortium innovation if you're looking at not just once, twice, 3 times, but like the 10x type of changes that you could not do otherwise. So you bring a consortium together where everybody focuses on what they do best. And that is everybody, right? We're looking at a project where how do we get people to live on 50 liters a day rather than per household, right? In 50 liters rather than the 200, 250 as we tend to be. And some of the pilots, we got even involved with religious organizations, because in the Middle East, religious organizations were talking about, you need to wash yourself before going to a holy place. And then the question was, well, could you use filtered water for that? Or does it have to be pure water? You don't want to get social media in the way. So upfront engagement of those type of parties is what a consortium can entail. It needs to have a higher goal that brings everybody together, right? Where everybody can champion around. And then the third area, it's got to be the win for all parties involved, right? The anchor, the big company cannot just look after itself. It's got to look at, okay, if everybody plays a role here, how do we make sure that everybody comes out stronger and better, as well as the world in general along the way? So that leads me to, I think, my last slide, Jon. If you would have to get started, well, what would you do? I probably would start with myself and say, okay, as a leader, you have to embrace that you have an important role in the innovation process, that you get strategically involved around what assumptions are no longer holding, what is possible now that was not possible before. This is often very strategic work, and you have to define the core. Where do I want to become best in the world at? Therefore, who are the best parties along the way? Hackathons are a great way to scout, and I say scout because hackathons are often presented as if, okay, let's just go out there, and after the end of the hackathon in 3 days, we'll be so much better off. That might be true in the IT industry. In the more hard economy, if I can call it that way, the more real challenges, they don't get resolved in 2-3 days. But you do bring together potentially a lot of players. So joining hackathons or organizing hackathons can be a great way to figure out who else is playing and might be important players to pull together into a bit of an ecosystem. Like I said, the cohabitation, taking a seat at other companies might be another great idea to get better connected, you or employees of you, or getting other employees to come and sit with you guys might be a great way of doing that. Obviously in a firewall setting, in the sense that you're not putting things at risk, but also bringing the world much more into your company or your employees much more into other companies. Then you got to set a goal of cooperation. It's got to be very explicit that it is about finding the best solution, not necessarily that it has to come from your own people. And it sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many structures are preventing people from, taking an idea and run with it. The non-invented here syndrome still is very strong in most companies. Then give back. Very often, particularly the larger companies, have a lot of knowledge that you can give back. If Procter and Gamble, and they're starting to build now an ecosystem, there's going to be more announcement on that coming out a bit later. But they want to build an ecosystem around sustainability in that space, right? Around what plastic recycling could be, or lower temperature washing could be, or global warming solutions, anything that you want. But they are also sitting on a lot of data on consumer habits or on digital marketing or anything like that. So would they be willing to give speeches once a month for their ecosystem around what they have learned about digital marketing? And that might attract a lot of people and might give value back to their network that is very different than just from money coming along the way, right? So the value that every company has relative to others might be something that you have to think about differently than just in monetary terms. Obviously, you got to think holistic. You got to do it from A to Z. If you want to start recycling plastics, then it is no longer about just the makers of the brands, right? Although that can be challenging, because all of a sudden you might have to organize a meeting where your competitors are also in the room. But also around, hey, how does the trash system work? Where does the separation take place of the different plastics? What are the plastics going to be used for after they're being reused? And a lot of those elements are companies that never work together or hardly ever talk to each other. So building an ecosystem holistically is incredibly important. And then the last one, and I think the EU really has an advantage here relative to, say, the US, is that the EU is making a lot of money available to bring ecosystems together around challenges. Whether that is sustainability, whether that is the closed cycle economy. And that could be a great way to use money to create consortia, to have a legitimate reason to sit around the table with a competitor, because you're trying to something much bigger than what just the brand in itself tends to stand for. I think that's more or less the story that I had. If I were you, reach out if I can help in any way. Like I said, I'll send this deck to you all. Whether that is about finding students for your project, you just want to talk for a half an hour to see where things stand. If you want to know more about this corp working of having people sit at different companies' desks, or a basic training on innovation culture, Franklin Covey does this great training called Fight and Why. I'll be very happy to engage.
John, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion, or well, talk more like. I would like to open up for some questions. Some people sent their questions up front, but obviously, as I'm looking through the list, some of them are already addressed. Maybe I'll ask myself a question, since you're so kind to accept our invitation. For the people who are interested in contacting you, maybe you briefly explain what you could do and how they can contact you.
Thank you for that, Jon, and thank you for the opportunity. So yes, if I can help, reach out, and that can also be just having a conversation of possibilities, right, in the spaces that we talk. If you look at kind of like the portfolios that I see that most companies tend to take, it can be a morning talk about strategy. Sometimes we do a 5-day type of consultation where we interview people internally and externally, and just because we're outside people, we come to a fresh recommendation that is often surprising the people who've been working and looking at a certain challenge with a certain mindset already for a long way. A great way to all do that is a workshop, a blue ocean type of workshop, right? Which some of you might be familiar with. It's been around for a while, but still a great starter to look at your market and how could you define things differently, innovating in business models. And then in the group that I work with, there's quite a range of senior managers that can also become an advisory board or a sounding board. We at times get hired for, you know, a monthly advisory element or consultancy, so more as an advisory board in the background rather than the forefront. So yes, open for possibilities in this space as we're all learning and growing.
Okay. I was going to read some of the questions, but what if we make this a bit more engaging and actually we ask the participants to address the question verbally. So feel free to come up with some questions, please.
Yeah, I can get started. It's Brigitte here. Thank you, John, for this very interesting talk. I was wondering whether you can give us some more insights around IP challenges that you might have encountered and how you have solved them. IP is always a sensitive issue, and you have touched briefly on this, but I'd be keen to get a little more from more of your insights on that.
Thank you, Brigitte. Yes, we could easily do another session just talking IP, because this is so. I would make 2 points if that's okay with you. The first one is IP is very different depending on the industry. If I work with the guys from John Deere, their patents tend to be on equipment that is virtually not changing for 10 years. Yeah, they improve every few years, but the patent is still incredibly important in that industry. If you talk people in the software space, the valid of IP becomes much more, you know, not patent-based, but might be more branding-based or elements like that. So I think you can't answer IP just in general. We need to be clear about what the IP is and what is the true validity of the IP relative to speed, because very often IP gets in the way, which is my second point. The experience that I have is that if I used to, in my more naive days, I would go to a lawyer and say, tell me what is possible in a partnership with party X. And then the two lawyers of party X and us would get together and talk, and they would come back with, I don't know, 40 pages, and we basically couldn't do anything. What I've learned is to flip it around and say, you know, the IP lawyers are a service to what needs to get done to win in the business. So I would rather define and say, well, to win in this business, we need to be able to work together and share ideas freely and this, that. And then how do we put that letter of intent type of language, which was 1-2 pages, into legal agreements, because the legal agreements obviously still were important. But I was trying to flip it around and say, first of all, what do we really want to do here together? And then let the lawyers write the principles underneath rather than starting from the lawyers, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so then maybe just to follow up, to be a little more specific on one of the topics that I'd love to get your insights on. I mean, very often what I see is, as you say, IP gets in the way. So how do you deal with a situation where you have obviously different parties coming to the table, they all have their IP, but then you start co-creating and co-developing, and some of that, well, I assume that in open innovation you would share that IP, but you still have your foreground IP having, well, different parties have different weight in this. So how do you protect yourselves in that game?
Thank you. It's going to be in order two. The first one is a quick example of what I've done, for example, around 3D printing, where we did the first brainstorming and there were no legal agreements in place. So everybody needs to be briefed and say, look, let's be careful what we say here. This is not protected, but here are some of the challenges that we're facing. What do you guys think? And we had a conversation with about 20 potential companies, and out of there we picked, I think it was one professor and 3 companies that really impressed us. And then we took them to see in our factory some of the challenges we were facing. And they quickly came back and say, yeah, we think that we can do something. And then with those 3 parties, we started diving deeper into making an agreement. But we already had done some first assessment about, is this person interesting for us or not? Do they know stuff that we want to get to? So there was already a screening that was done in open space before we got into the IP space. And then the second area, the principles that I've always tried to live to is, one, whatever background IP is background IP. So if I own something and you own something, starting this relationship, then that needs to be separate. And the second element is who pays owns the IP. So if I work with you, but I start paying you for the work that you do, then it's my IP. But if we said, no, I'm going to work freely just as you, and we'll do it at a manpower range of 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, then that's the type of range that we're also trying to build into the IP split, if that makes sense. Yeah,
so you don't necessarily take the background IP and the value of that into account, because of obviously that, if that background IP is very valuable, the party that doesn't bring any IP to the table is hugely benefiting from that to create the new IP. Yeah?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So background IP stays with the parties. Very rarely does it bring in. Sometimes that happens under a joint venture, but that's a next step. That's not what I would call just in the open innovation space yet.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you, Bridget.
Okay, we still have time for a question. Actually, I want to, respect people's time, and if you have to leave, please feel free to when we finish. Otherwise, maybe we stay a few more minutes. I find this part more interesting, the interactive part. So, please, if you have any more questions, address them to John. If not, I'll throw one, John.
Yeah.
I saw from the list of participants, somebody asked how is different innovation in a corporate versus innovation in an SME? If you can elaborate more on this.
It's a great question. So now that I've seen both sides, right, the corporates tend to be comfort innovation, in the sense that you do innovation, but you have your paycheck on Friday, innovation happens, but it happens relatively slow. But then once you've got something interesting, you call it Gillette or you call it whatever, right? And you put a brand name on it, and there's marketing spending, and scaling goes incredibly fast. What tends to happen a little bit more at younger companies is that they're incredibly fast at that beginning range, and it's what I would call desperate innovation. They don't know where the next paycheck is coming from, so they're willing to do anything, and hence the speedboat principle that we use there. But then their challenge then often is in terms of scaling. So now I've got something that worked, but how do I get people to know that it works, and how do I get it to grow? And it's a scaling challenge. And therefore, what 9.5 Ventures, for example, is trying to do is say, look, we're going to take an idea, but we're going to put it outside of a core company, and we're really going to make it a small company that needs to accelerate and innovate as quickly as possible, so that in 2-3 years, they've got something that works. And then you bring in the Telenet or the big companies and say, okay, now use your power, your money, your branding to scale it, so that you do that whole process a lot faster. The whole innovation process, say 3 years, 4 years of a new product, and 8 years of scaling in a startup leads you to about 12 years. If you look at corporates and you look at how long it takes them to do it, it still is about 10 years, 10 plus years to hit something very big. So I think there are opportunities for speedboats and tankers to learn to work together better. Let startups do what they are best at, and then let's do the big companies do what they are best at, which is scaling. So once something is proven, how do you scale it? That is where bigger companies tend to be very good at. And you let the smaller companies do the more risky, disruptive, early work.
All right. Great. Any last burning question, or should I try to finish?
If I can just follow up on that, because it was my question. My name is Guido Verzwijfel. I'm amongst other things, I'm teaching at INSEAD the course REP, which is taking over a small or medium-sized company rather than going to work for a big one. John, if you were talking about innovation, you were concentrating or on the one hand, which is the small startup, which is one world, or the big corporate. But what about all these companies that exist for so many years, where a lot of people are working in Belgium? How do you make sure that we are not losing them all because of innovation done by others?
Thank you for that clarification, and that is a great question.
I mean, of course, I'm amongst others also part of Ban Vlaanderen, which is the business angels network in the Flemish region. So I know a little bit about startups, I know a little bit about corporates, but you have all the things in the middle. They have to survive too in these difficult times.
Yes, and since the academic background, I forgot the name of the professor, the Belgian guy that wrote this book around open innovation in SMEs. Are you aware of that?
Sorry, I should look it up then. It's a Belgian professor. Okay.
Yeah, I'll get you in touch. If I just want to make. If you're on the chat, can you write down your email? Then I'll follow up and I'll make sure, because it is a great discussion, because it is the bread and butter of the startups are the ones that are the 3 students type of thing, right?
Yeah.
But the majority of the economy is in that family / 100 employees type of space, and I think that and them pulling together is what we need.